Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 33. I'm Enigmius and today we're starting a new ship build. Just like that, we just finished the last one and now we're starting a new one. It's generally the way it works. I haven't really decided on a purpose for this ship. I don't really necessarily see a lot of distinction between a ship that can do a little bit of everything and a ship that's supposedly specialized for one specific task. This one maybe would be a little bit more combat oriented. We're going to be devoting less space to things like cargo capacity, but it will have some cargo capacity, just maybe not as much as you might expect from a freighter style of a ship. That being said, there's nothing saying that you can't swap the weapon turrets for non-weapon turrets and make it a miner or a salvager or whatever. Now the ship is called Serpovectem, which is kind of a hamburger mashup of different Latin words. I looked up the Latin word for serpentine and it came up with something serpentinium vectum or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a little bit too large to use as the name for one ship, and Serpento seemed a little bit too short and also too much like a bad guy G.I. Joe vehicle. So I just decided to mash them together, and you'll see by the end of this video probably why it got that name. Is basically when I was envisioning the design for the hull, the front end of the ship reminded me of a snake's head. So that was basically where it all came from, and then from that I decided to kind of roll with the theme a little bit and do kind of a flowing, curvy, snake-like main hull, and then anything that we do after that doesn't necessarily have to be bound to the snake theme. Just the main central area is going to have that sort of curvy, creepy, slinking body sort of look to it. So one of the goals that I had for this design, and I said this in the last build and I'm saying it again here, is I wanted to try and keep the spacing, the block sizes, as granular as possible, which is to say everything is sort of lined up in the same grid, so that when I build something in one area of the ship and extend it over to another area of the ship, it should line up with what we find in that other area. We shouldn't have to worry about there being wonky offsets that we can't match up. And I've already with the profiling that I've been doing, lining things up, I've already determined that it's working. It's working better than it has in the past, because I've been very, very rigid about using it. And what you can see here as I'm building up this profile is that I'm using wide-ish blocks, but their side profile is a square. It's basically the smallest square that you can get at this block scale. Anything you can do one step smaller and make it a rectangle, and then that would be the smallest, narrowest size that you could make based on the scale and etc, etc. But in order to make it a square, it's the smallest square that we can make, and then we merge them together in a lot of cases, so that if we're trying to, for example, make this curving sort of top section of the ship, we can take a bunch of those square profiles and we gather them all up, we group them all up, and then we merge them together so that they make rectangular profiles, and that makes it easier to line up the slope blocks on top of them so that they have that refined curve edge and it's no longer a pixel art kind of construction. So the basis is based on these little squares, and you'll see very, very consistently throughout this entire process that that's how it starts. As we place the blocks, they've got the square side profile, we group them together, we merge them, and then we place the sloped blocks on top of them. But what you'll also notice is that we're still leaving one square block, or referring to the side profile, that we're not merging, and that's there so that later on, if we decide that we want to add different things in different places near where we're working, we still have that side profile that we can grab hold of and extend in various different directions, do whatever we want So this is me trying to refine the concept of using this sort of granular building method to keep things easier to line up and easier to work with as we move along. And it's, like I say, it seems to be working with this build quite well. I don't feel in this case as though things are sort of out of control and not necessarily working the way that I would like them to. You can see I just removed a big section or a relatively large section that I had just placed because it didn't have the angle that I was looking for. It wasn't curving the way that I wanted it to. And it's very, very easy in this sort of case to make adjustments to the curve just by adjusting how many of those square blocks, those square side profiles we stack next to one another, and the incrementation as we follow along a curve. We start off with maybe narrow blocks, and then they get a little bit longer to a certain point, and then they start to recede. They start to get a little bit smaller, and then they get longer, they get smaller, and that's how we vary the curve in the profile, is just by adjusting the length of these groups of blocks that we're using so that it's a curve instead of just a straight sort of angular slope. Ultimately, I still have no idea whatsoever about where I'm going to put all of the equipment, how the ship is going to be oriented to protect itself, but I have some general ideas about where we might have space to do these things. One of the things that I mentioned in the last video, towards the end of the video, talking about what we had on deck coming up, was this build. I wanted to do some experimentation with different systems just to see how they influence the actual performance of the ship. And one of the things that I'm very, very keen to take a close look at is the placement of directional thrusters, inertial dampeners. I don't expect inertial dampeners to be that big of a deal in terms of the placement within the ship and in terms of how they perform, but things like the directional thrusters, for example, and how we get the best benefit to the yaw, the pitch, and the roll of the ship based on where they're placed relative to the center mass of the ship. So there's going to be a fairly significant amount of thought put into how we want to line those things up so that we get the best performance possible out of the things that we're placing. Because one of the things that I found with the last build was that things looked good for a short while, and then they just sort of changed. And like I commented, I don't know if it was a bug. I don't know if it was a change that was actually made to the mechanics of the game sometime in the middle of the process of building that ship. But by the time we'd finished adding everything, we just had so much mass. The ship was so large, it didn't matter if we shrunk it down relative to the number of thrusters that we had and the location of those thrusters. The performance of the ship was considerably lesser than what I was expecting based on what I could see midway through the build. And this is an example of a situation where I have questions in the back of my mind. Some people have offered some answers to those questions based on things that I've already discussed, and now it makes sense to me to kind of put a little bit of thought and effort into ascertaining once and for all, at least up to the way the game is designed to work at this particular moment in time, how to get the best out of these systems so that we can produce the kinds of ships that we want to produce, or at least go in understanding that based on the kind of ship that we're building, that maybe it's going to be limited in certain capacities, and be able to account for that in our mind's eye when we're thinking about how the ship is going to behave. Just understanding it, I think, will go a long way to easing the shock and mild disappointment when things don't quite work out towards the end of the process the way that we'd expected it to. So now you've seen we got the top profile, and we did sort of the back end. It's kind of sloping back to front as we go from top to bottom. And this part here is actually more significant than it might look. This specific, the way this transitions from the curve across the top to the very tip of the very front of the ship, and now it's got that slope. It's not a very aggressive slope in the sense that, you know, how much it's moving front to back, but top down, it's fairly aggressive. It's almost flat on the snub nose of the ship, and then it starts to curve back with that softer, dare I say, more elegant kind of curve. And the reason is, as we start to actually fill out the hull and build out from this profile that we're creating, that specific angle, that very front section that's got that slope from top to bottom, is going to be a very noticeable structural feature of the ship. It's not going to be a big deal, but it's going to be very noticeable, and I wanted to make sure that whatever I left there, whatever I put there, was going to be something that I was happy with, because after I start filling things out, if I'm not happy with it now, I'm definitely not going to be happy with it when I start adding to it and expanding on that specific profile as it comes around the sides of the ship. So we have to be a little bit cautious, and I find that this is the best place in a build to be uncompromising in terms of the profile and the layout, and looking at it and saying, yes, I'm happy with that, I can work with that. It's a pretty good representation of what I had in mind when I started the build, or maybe it's different from what I had in mind, but I like it better. That's always an option as well. It doesn't have to always be exactly what I had in my head. But by having that sort of approach, where I'm deciding as we work through these profiles that I'm happy with it or I'm not, and if I'm not, change it, I'm saving an enormous amount of time later on. There have been so many times, so many builds, so many games where I wasn't quite happy with it. I knew I wasn't quite happy with it, but I kept on building anyways, and it always caught up to me and put me in a position where either I had to make a lot of changes and they were time consuming and they were tedious, because changing something and trying to make the changes fit with everything that's left around it is always more difficult than building from scratch. But also, if you invest a lot of time into building something and you realize the only way to fix it, because you made the mistake at the beginning and you just rolled with it, is you end up having to remove that entire area and replace it anyway. So if I see it now and I'm not convinced that I'm satisfied with it, this is the time to change it. This is the time to kind of be a little bit proactive and not trust to my own changing sort of inclinations as the build progresses, because it usually ends up working in my favor if I change it now. We save time. I'm happier with the build as we progress through it. There's less, whenever I do something, or specifically whenever I've done something and I wasn't happy with it and I kept building through it anyways, there's always that question in the back of my mind, how am I going to make this in line with something that I would be happy with? Am I going to be able to do that the way that I'm approaching it now, just kind of pushing through, or am I just wasting my time? Every time I asked that question, the answer was yes, I'm just wasting my time. So keeping that in mind, there actually was one version of this build that I started and I got about as far as we are now, and I basically started over. I wiped out the entire thing and I started over, because when we're talking about these kinds of curves and having them flow and sort of work together, it's another one of those things where if you have to go back and change it and try and make it line up with the parts that you are happy with, it's usually a fairly challenging thing to do. I decided that I was not far enough along with the build. I hadn't put in as much time as I would expect when I reached that point where I say we're too far along to just scrap the whole thing. So it made sense to start over in this particular case, and that's what I did. And the end result is something that I'm quite happy with going forward with the rest of the build. So sometimes that's just the way it is. I start out with an idea and things don't quite line up the way that I would expect them to, and I scrap it and start over. You've probably seen it if you've been following some of the builds that I've done in the past. In this case, I decided not to show you the first iteration because it wasn't really showing anything significant that you can't see with this second time around. The one benefit being that the second time around is the one that we're keeping. and the one that we're moving forward with. So last thing we have to do before we finish off this side profile of the main hull is just group everything, attach the slopes, get everything looking all nice and soft and curved and ready to proceed. I realized that it sometimes makes it much easier to see exactly what's going on at this stage of the build if I highlight the whole thing, because then we get the whites, the very bright white outlines of all the individual blocks so that you can see sort of what I have in mind. So I'm going to try and keep doing that with these builds as they progress. It's sort of giving you, you know, a brief look at things with everything that's highlighted, just so that things stand out a little bit better. So we've got the side profile of the ship is basically done. And what I did, you'll see, I've sort of built out a temporary structure through the ship, going a certain distance above and a certain distance below. And that's just to hold this profile that we're adding now, which is a great big ellipse that I got from plots.co.uk. This was definitely not something that I wanted to do freehand, because it's so large and there's so many blocks involved that, again, if it's one of those things, if you make a mistake, fixing it can be extremely difficult. Getting everything to line up, you can spend an awful lot of time tweaking and modifying, trying to get it to the point where you're happy with it. I get a lot of saved time by just using the tools that are available to kind of give me the proper geometry right from the beginning, and then as long as I duplicate that geometry properly, I end up with a shape that I'm happy with, and I don't have to spend an inordinate amount of time mucking about. If you're trying to draw an ellipse freehand and you aren't successful, it's obvious immediately. It is another way to describe it. So there's a lot to be said for, you know, why reinvent the wheel. There are times when I like to do freehand curves, like I did with the side profile of the ship up to this point. Or even doing circles and things, usually of a smaller size, because they're a little bit easier not only to create but also modify if things don't quite work out. But you can see the number of blocks that I'm placing for this ellipse is fairly substantial. There's just a lot of various different segments that we're putting together in order to make this shape the way that it's supposed to be. One of the things that I often do when I get a shape like this off of a site like plots.co.uk is, after I get it in place, I'll go around and I'll check some of the more odd combinations, the different segments as it's going through the curve. Sometimes you can make some adjustments that are very straightforward that make the shape more suitable for what we're trying to do. Based on the size and various different things. Just by looking at it, you'll sometimes see that there are things that you can adjust ever so slightly in parts of the profile to make it a little bit better. But in this case, I haven't got to that point yet. I just basically roughed in the ellipse. And now I'm going to be roughing in a couple of sloped sections that will be part of the profile of this elliptical section that we just built. Now, I can tell you from the very start that there are going to be some challenging elements in making all of these shapes come together, because, again, compound curves can be very, very tricky at the best of times. And I've got compound curves, working with compound curves, working with slopes, working with stuff, intersecting with things. So it could be a bit tricky, but you've got an idea now, or you will in a minute or so, of where we're going with the general shape of things. In the next episode, we're going to start filling things in, and it'll start to look less like a collection of profiles and more like the beginnings of a ship. And we'll go from there. We'll see exactly what we can see. This could be a long build. It could be a surprisingly short one. I don't know, but we're going to find out. So if you want to be notified about the next episode in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel and or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.